Well, hello everyone on this cold and windy morning. Tim, I see it's snowing where you are. Yeah, seems like an annual April tradition where we're all excited for spring and it snows on us. So it just seems to be the thing with April. Welcome to our Materials Handling Campaign Safety Connection, hosted by Workplace Safety and Prevention Services and the Ministry of Labor, Immigration Training and Skills Development. Just to note, WSPS is recording the Safety Connection, so we can post it on our website for others to enjoy. My name is Don Patton. I'm a specialized services consultant in ergonomics with WSPS. Just a few housekeeping items to get to before we begin. Our outstanding IT department recommends that you use computer audio. There's a phone conference for audio only if you're having any issues connecting. We do recommend using a headset or earbuds for a better audio experience, which is, if you're lucky, may turn my monotone voice into a stereo experience. Again, thank you for muting other devices and apps to avoid distractions. We have muted your microphone and cameras will be off throughout this presentation. If you do have any questions, we ask that you use the chat. You'll see that button at the bottom of your screen, and you can enter questions on the right-hand side. We will answer your questions at the end of the presentation. I'll just keep track of them as we go. Of course, we may or may not get to all of those questions, but certainly if we don't, we'll respond via email and send out to all participants. Just to note on those questions, Julie, our guest of honor, will not answer any questions related to any ongoing investigations, specific orders that you may have received, or any ongoing ministry visit. If you have any specific questions, contact your inspector or the MLITSD Health and Safety Contact Center. We'll put that number in the chat. However, it is 1-877-202-0008 or via teletypewriter 1-855-653-9260. For a better viewing experience, please do me a favor and hit the three buttons at the bottom of your screen. You can view that presentation in full screen mode. WSPS and MLITSD would like to invite you to answer a few questions to understand better what you may already know about this topic. The survey will help us understand the usefulness of this webinar and get any feedback on its effectiveness in helping workplaces address health and safety issues and prepare for future campaigns and inspections. The survey results will improve future awareness of webinars and campaigns. So just go ahead and scan the QR code on your screen and the brief survey will load up. Just to note, no identifying information will be collected or asked for, and all responses are completely anonymous. This is a MLITSD survey, and the responses will be shared with WSPS as questions are relevant to both our organizations. As I mentioned, responses are confidential, and results will only be analyzed in aggregate form. This survey is voluntary and will not impact the likelihood of being inspected by a Ministry of Health and Safety inspector, and we appreciate your participation. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Julie Giroux. Julie is a provincial specialist with the Occupational Health and Safety Branch, the Fair, Safe, and Healthy Workplaces Division. Welcome, Julie, and take it away.
Thank you, Don. Just a little bit more about myself. I'm in my 21st year with the Ministry of Labor. I spent the first 14 years as an occupational health and safety inspector with the industrial program, and the last 6.5 years as a provincial specialist. And don't let my spring colors fool you. As some of you have mentioned, there's some snow. We're in a kind of a weather warning where I am on the shores of the St. Lawrence in Eastern Ontario, and it is a little bit of a winter wonderland out today. So yeah, a little springtime surprise. So we're just going to start off with our standard disclaimer here that the presentation, of course, is not legal advice. It is intended to be a resource for you and does not replace the Occupational Health and Safety Act or its regulations and should not be used as or considered legal advice. Health and safety inspectors apply the law based on the facts as they see them in the workplace. The legislation provides minimum standards only. This presentation covers some of the minimum rights and obligations under the Act, and it is the responsibility of all individuals in the workplace to ensure that compliance with the legislation. This is an overview of what we're going to go through today. So Don and myself, and I'm not going to kind of go through all these, but just so that you have them as a resource to, if you want to go back to something later on, you know, you'll probably get a copy of this presentation so you can have a look. So we'll move on to the next one. So, and thank you again for making the time to participate in this webinar and getting more information about our 2025-2026 material handling campaign. It is our third year doing this or picking this subject, this topic for a campaign, and there's a reason for that, and I will go through that a little bit later on. So our focus, as usual, is raising awareness of the material handling hazards faced by workers in industrial workplaces. And material handling hazards continue to be the top causes of fatalities. So that's why we've continued to select this hazard as our topic for our campaign. Sadly, in 2024, there were 2 fatalities suffered by young workers aged 20-24, though thankfully a drop from 7 in 2023. The campaign aims to increase compliance with the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the regulations. Our goals are to prevent injuries and illnesses that could arise from unsafe work practices. We are also hoping to raise awareness of the key health and safety material handling hazards out there and ensure that workplace parties are complying with the legislation. As well, we're offering a referral service for employers to the Workplace Safety and Prevention Services who might need assistance in complying with the legislation, and there will be more information on that later on in the presentation. So when we look at the last 5 years, hazards related to material handling continue to be the top causes of fatalities. But the work I think that we're doing, and certainly the work that employers in Ontario are doing, are bringing the numbers down. So when we look at the high back in 2022 of 43 fatalities, 16 of which were attributed to being crushed by something and 7 were attributed to being struck by something, you can see that the numbers are going down. So 30 fatalities in 2023 and then 27 last year in 2024. I prepared this slide deck a few weeks ago, and there was 7 fatalities in 2025. Unfortunately, that number has gone up to 11 fatalities so far in 2025, and 5 of which are attributed to the farming and agricultural sectors. So yeah, so it does change, unfortunately, sometimes, you know, quickly. We'll move on to the next slide. When will the campaign occur? So it's already started. So it started on April 1st. Inspectors are out there for their proactive work. They may select this campaign and do visits in workplaces. And it'll run till the end of March 2026. Education and awareness for employers and workers, being led by Workplace Safety and Prevention Services and supported also by the Public Services Health and Safety Association, will last the entirety of the campaign. Just a few court bulletins just to highlight some of the work that's done by the inspectors following investigations. And the court bulletins, there's a hyperlink, so you can access all of our court bulletins. So this is from December 2024. This is not when the incident occurred, of course, but this was the when the decision was made public. So a company that produces polymeric coated textile fabrics and vinyl films for the automotive and industrial applications industry pled guilty and was fined $175,000 after a worker was injured being caught in the pinch point of a machine. So the company failed to ensure that the worker was protected from that pinch point as required by Section 25 of the Industrial Regulations. And it was contrary to Section 25(1)(c) of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. One more for you, just to highlight that a tool and die company that manufactures auto parts did plead guilty and was fined $180,000 after a worker was fatally injured while troubleshooting a stamping press. So the company failed to ensure that the motion of any part of the press that could endanger a worker was stopped and blocked during maintenance work, as required by Section 75 of Regulation 851, and contrary to Section 25(1)(c) of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The spotlight. So inspectors, when they are out there as part of the campaign, will pay particular attention to workplaces where there might be new and young workers. And so they may ask you those questions, do you have anybody that's been here less than 3 or 4 months, or do you have anybody that's under the age of 24? They're going to be interested in that and to see what you're doing to protect those new and young workers. And they're also going to ask if you have any temporary help agency workers. So that's another thing that the ministry is interested in, is protecting our most vulnerable workers. So of course, a lot of the workplaces where inspectors can or do go as part of this material handling campaign might be a small business and or employ vulnerable workers. And when they're looking in the farming or agricultural sector, they're looking because there's often complex material handling. And that's a result of the non-standardized loads that are in the ag sector. And also there is vulnerable workers, temporary help agency workers. So the farming and ag sector is that's why they continue to be included in these material handling campaign from year to year. Next slide. So inspectors will focus on certain job tasks in industrial workplaces that put workers at risk of being struck by or crushed by. These can include, but are not limited to, cleaning around moving equipment, how pedestrians move around equipment, especially if it's moving equipment and machinery like lifting devices. The repairing or adjusting of machinery, so making sure that workers are doing that in a safe manner. Lift truck operations around storage systems, so making sure that if they might look at your storage system and see if there's any damage to it, or severe damage where it might reflect on the lift truck operations that are going on. Maybe there's not enough room, maybe the training is inadequate. And also they will be looking at manual material handling. And in the farming and ag sector, they are going to look at the movement of produce, the receptacles used for that produce, making sure that they're appropriate and that they're in good condition, and the manual handling of produce and equipment, and that the equipment that is used is in good condition. Where are inspectors going? So we've split it up into 2 different kind of groups. So the first group is the priority sector, which is typically where fatalities are occurring. So this is the agricultural services sector, the automotive sector, new for this year's campaign, the chemical, rubber, and plastics sector, the farming sector, industrial services sector, primary metals, and the wood and metal fabrication sector. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the industrial services sector, those provide a service to an industry rather than a product. So for example, elevator and escalator maintenance would be an industrial service. Linen supply companies, custom welding, this type of thing, window washing. And so other key sectors also included, and this is typically where we see a lot of critical injuries. So the food, beverage, and tobacco sector, government services, but we focus on municipal services for this particular campaign. Retail, the tourism, hospitality, and recreational services sector, the transportation sector, and vehicle sales and service. So for some of you who might be wondering what the photo represents, so this is a worker was using a large overhead crane to move a die into a storage area, and the worker using the remote control, he was using a remote control pendant, the individual, and the worker unfortunately pinned himself between the die and the yellow guardrail. The campaign priority, so how workers are handling material and the equipment they use for the task is a key focus for inspectors. And some of the topics and hazards that they're going to be focused on, including lifting devices, mobile equipment, cranes, the workplace layout and design, and especially as it relates to moving equipment. So those lifting devices, manual material handling, storage systems, automation, machine guarding, blocking, and lockout. And all of these will be covered by Dawn a little bit in much greater detail a little bit later on in the presentation. Inspectors are also going to be looking at ensuring that training and orientation is being provided by the employer. For example, the supervisor and worker awareness training, so the basic health and safety training. They're also going to be looking at administrative requirements, the internal responsibility system. For example, if you're required to have a committee, making sure that your committee's operating properly, that you're meeting quarterly, maintaining minutes, that you have certified members, or, you know, if you have a health and safety rep, that person is doing monthly workplace inspections, this type of thing. What can you expect during an inspection? So during an inspection, inspectors will enforce the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its regulations based on the facts at the time of the inspection. An inspector has the right to enter and be granted access to all areas of the workplace. When an inspector arrives at your workplace, they'll introduce themselves, they'll explain the reason for the visit, and ask to have a worker and management representative accompany them during the inspection. Typically, this would be if the certified worker or your worker representative is available and at the workplace, then that would be the person that would accompany the inspector. The inspector may conduct an administrative review, typically at the outset of the visit. So they'll, you know, sit in the office, ask you about your policy, maybe your health and safety policy, where you post a copy of the act, where you post maybe the minutes of your Joint Health and Safety Committee meeting if you have a committee, and ask you about training. And then they're going to typically go out and do a physical inspection of your workplace. If an inspector finds a contravention under the Occupational Health and Safety Act or one of the regulations, they may issue an order. The inspector will explain the contravention, and they may refer the workplace to a health and safety association for compliance assistance if they think that you might need some compliance assistance. Inspectors may issue stop work orders where an immediate threat to worker health and safety has been observed. A field visit report outlining the details of the visit, including any orders that might have been issued, will be provided to the employer and will be reviewed with the employer before the inspector leaves the workplace. For more information, you can always click on that link. Inspectors will determine compliance with the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the regulations. So are employers, supervisors, and workers complying with their general duties under the Occupational Health and Safety Act? This can, for employers, this can include, but of course is not limited to, Section 25(1)(b). So are equipment, materials, and protective devices provided by the employer, are they maintained in good condition? Section 25(2)(a) is information, instruction, and supervision provided to workers to protect their health and safety. Under Section 25(2)(d), employers are going to want to ensure that workers are acquainted, or the person in authority over a worker are acquainted with any hazard in the work and in the handling, storage, use, disposal, and transport of any article, device, equipment, or a biological, chemical, or physical agent. And then, of course, 25(2)(h). Employers are going to want to ensure that they take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of a worker. For supervisors, what the sections that are most commonly referred to would be under Section 27(1)(a). So supervisors want to ensure that a worker works in a manner and with the protective devices, measures, and procedures required by the Act and the regulations. Under 27(1)(b), ensure that any equipment, protective devices, or clothing required by the employer is used or worn by the worker. And advise a worker of any potential or actual danger to the health and safety of the worker of which the supervisor is aware. And the supervisors also have a duty to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of workers under Section 27(2)(c). And a little bit later on during the presentation, I will go through the most commonly issued orders. So I know some folks are interested in that. So I will go through that a little bit later on. Where the industrial regulations apply, some of the relevant provisions that employers may want to familiarize themselves with include Section 11. So ensuring that work surfaces, including floors, are kept clean, free of debris, free of obstruction. So in the case of this photo, if an inspector observed this, they would typically issue an order under Section 11 to make sure that the floor area in front of the emergency exit is kept free of the accumulation of boxes and materials. Section 12 also, so the making sure that there's an adequate clearance between moving parts of a machine and another machine, structure, or thing. That's where the crush by injuries come in. Section 45 and 46, ensuring that there's safe material handling. Section 51, so lifting devices. So typically that order is issued to ensure that the lifting device has been inspected in the last year to ensure that it is still capable of lifting its maximum rated load. And then Section 54 for mobile equipment. Again, employers want to ensure that workers and supervisors have completed the occupational health and safety awareness training, and that there are free resources that the ministry provides that can be used for compliance. The links are there if folks want to access that. And now I throw it over to Don.
All right, thanks, Julie. And just a reminder, if you do have a question, just don't be shy, throw it in the chat. And like we said, we'll answer those towards the end of the presentation. Of course, if we need to go back into the presentation to that particular slide they have a question for, then we can certainly do that too as we go. Okay, so just a couple and just things you can kind of consider to uh, kind of comply, or at least work your way towards compliance to some of the focuses that the inspectors are looking at. Um, and and like Julie said, we've been kind of going through this for the last couple of years. And like I said in the chat there, that we'll provide you with some resources that have been developed, based on this information in the past. And certainly if there's anything that you need as participants that we would need to create, or you need to provide more, we need to provide more information on, that's kind of our role as WSPS. Anything that you're having trouble with, or have questions about how certain portions of the legislation may apply, we can certainly help you out with that as well. So just a couple things with lifting devices, mobile equipment, and cranes. So of course, we want to ensure that all equipment has been added to your preventative maintenance program. As Julie mentioned before, and not just the maintenance of the equipment, but how the maintenance is to occur, right? So just like that example that Julie provided before about somebody doing maintenance, and or at least taking equipment and using cranes to transport that equipment from one location to the next. That work plan should be laid out of how you're actually going to perform that preventative maintenance, in addition to the fact that you want to do preventative maintenance, right? So it's a little bit hand in hand, just because there's many different factors that will occur, or could occur based on the work environment, right? Where things need to go to, and you have to consider all of the activities that are going to occur for that particular piece of equipment, right? So yes, putting preventative maintenance and ensuring that that equipment is well maintained, nothing's going to break down, the safety devices are operating as intended, those types of things. But certainly how you are able to perform that maintenance is important as well. Creating any checklist for pre-use inspections is great as well. So, I know we've produced a bunch of checklists in the past. We do have some more coming out to help you with those pre-use inspections. Provide proper training on all lifting devices and mobile equipment. Again, considering where those things have to go. Again, same with that person being crushed between the die and the barrier. Providing proper equipment and setting up that work to ensure that the path of travel using that device is clear. So making sure you're doing some training as well. Of course, ensuring that all your training records are documented and available at all times. And other programs should be considered, such as impairment in the workplace, any relevant personal protective equipment, pre-start health and safety reviews, WMIS, of course, accident investigation, loading dock safety, etc. So all of those activities, like all of those, it's important with anything like lifting devices and mobile equipment and cranes, that all of those types of things are considered, just because it's not just the piece of equipment, it's how you interact with it, where you need to go. There's other things that happen at work that may alter that process. So just making sure that workers, supervisors are aware of how to pivot if things are different. Let's say you get a big shipment and that takes up some space that then may put you in harm's way. So just making sure you're accounting for all of those variables as you go, and it should all be centered around lifting devices, mobile equipment, and cranes, and their use. A lot of things that we've seen really have to do with how the workplace is laid out and how it's designed. And I get there's limitations to that for sure. Where the power is located, how much space you actually have, those types of things. But a lot of times, the way things are laid out and designed really can introduce hazards, right? Or if it's designed a certain way, maybe it prevents hazards, right? So hope this is a relevant example, but I was, cleaning my garage, this weekend and kind of moving things around and all those types of things. And eventually stuff was everywhere. Well, as I was kind of organizing things, I'm stepping on stuff and, um, kicking things and those types of things, just because things weren't really laid out or designed properly, so that I was kind of putting myself at risk from doing that, right? Just because of the way things were kind of laid out. So where there were no hazards before, as I was kind of organizing things, that now there were more hazards exist, and a lot of it has to do with manual tools handling. That's uh, that I'll get to in the next slide, but um, it's just hazards kind of in some cases hazards can come and go, right? Depending on the situation. That's why you want to look at reviewing that workplace layout and adjusting that so that you're ensuring that those hazards stay mitigated, right? Part of that, you look at your emergency procedures, look at emergency lighting, forklift fire extinguisher inspected, like all of the critical elements that you require to allow that area to function, right? Not just square footage, but everything in that area to mitigate some of that risk, and everything in there, right? So not just the equipment and the lighting and the fire extinguishers and those types of things, but the people that are in that area and how they're moving about that area, has to be considered, so that you can kind of dictate the flow of traffic and pedestrians and those types of things to ensure that we're trying to keep hazards separate, right, from machines separate from people and those types of things. Certainly what helps with that are barriers, warning signs, and safeguards. Those types of things are available, and using that correctly certainly will help to keep us separate. I mean, we see that in our build environment on roads, right? Like we have roundabouts with certain instructions, and I know it takes a bit of time for people to learn how to use those roundabouts and stuff like that. We got a ton of them here in Waterloo region where I live. um, but the fact that there's, I always wondered why there were trees and bushes and all that type of stuff in the middle of the roundabout, because I'd like to see on the other side to make sure no pedestrians are coming or cars, but it's designed that way so that people don't drive straight through the roundabout, right? So, which I guess has happened in the past. So just that design is kind of forcing me to go right? So, using barriers and warning signs to help direct traffic in certain circumstances, will definitely help to kind of separate, machines and people. And of course, we've seen certain things like blue lights to lift trucks or dome mirrors on blind corners, or I've seen LED lighting, stop signs being shone on the ground, and um, painting pedestrian walkways. I mean, I've heard of at least considerations of, I think it's expensive, but I mean, shining LED pathways on the ground as opposed to painting, just because the painting you have to do all the time. So there's lots of different solutions out there to try to design your work environment to kind of keep those hazards separate. Of course, we look at high visibility vests and dock areas and those types of things, and ensuring that those high visibility vests provide a good contrast between the individual and the background, right? I've heard of situations where, in recycling facility, for example, that the high vis vest that the person was wearing blended into the background just because of all the different colors and stuff like that of the recycling material. So just having that contrast between the individual and the background is important. And of course, considering a traffic management plan and train workers, right? I mean, we train ourselves, to walk on sidewalks, hopefully, and to look both ways when you cross the street and those types of things. And I know workplaces a little bit more um, chaotic is not the right term, but it's you need things need to be everywhere, but ensuring that you have that traffic management plan to try to control that flow of traffic and separate those pedestrians is very important. Okay. And I appreciate all the questions for sure. Like I said, we'll get to those at the end, but that's great. And people are, oh, Julie's answering. Well, perfect, great, okay. So when it comes to manual materials handling, certainly review the capacity for your workers to handle material. You know, the thing with manual materials handling is, you know, I get questions all the time about, you know, how much can somebody lift safely, right? And I'm sure you've heard of, you know, 23 kilograms or 51 pounds or whatever before. And um, you know, under perfect lifting conditions, that's okay for most people, but we know that nothing really is perfect in workplaces. So, and that has to do with the size of the object, the you know, the what's contained in the you know, the box that you're lifting. Maybe it's a liquid that moves around and it creates more you know, more force to move it around and those types of things. So yeah, you can use things like somebody mentioned the NIOSH lifting equation. You know, there are tools out there. We do have a tool that we created. We'll include it in the resources. It's a manual tools handling design insights document that gives you those numbers based on heights of people and reaching distances and those types of things, how to select carts for pushing and pulling, you know, those types of things. So trying to provide you with specific information to apply to the purchase of equipment, you know, or carts or boxes that you're lifting and those types of things. So um, so it's really definitely a challenge to answer the question about how much we can lift, but you know, at the very least, we want to train individuals on how to lift in your particular work environment. So, you know, if you are training people to bend their knees and keep their back straight, but they're lifting stuff overhead, it really doesn't apply, right? So how can we apply you know, different lifting advice, mechanics, those types of things to the things that you're actually lifting? So um, and making sure that that workers are trained specific to your work environment. Another focus is looking at handling materials on ladders. So as Julie had a picture before about ladders and storage of boxes everywhere and those types of things. I mean, you know, the purpose sometimes of shelving and, you know, storage areas obviously is going to be for storage, right? So you just throw a bunch of stuff in there. But at some point, perhaps people need to go in there to do certain things, right? In the case of that photo, one of those ones was to get out of the exit door, right? So, um, but you know, it's in using kind of ladders and, you know, shelving and those types of things. I mean, that really reduces our capacity, right? So if we're on an A-frame ladder, we're kind of relegated to the width of that ladder as far as our center of gravity, right? If we have to lean over to grab something, for example, because we're not quite where we need to be, um, you know, I know you've probably heard of 3 points of contact. We like to use 3 points of control, right? Like, are you really in control as you're leaning over? You're having to use more muscular effort to kind of keep you stabilized in that A-frame ladder as you're kind of reaching over. And who knows, you might fatigue, you know, your grip might let go, or you might fatigue, or what you're holding or pulling off a shelf is awkward, and that forces you to kind of go down, or you drop it because you can't hold it because you know, your shoulders, you know, is weaker when you're reaching out to the side. So there's lots of things with ladders that you know, could not only create an MSD, you know, a back injury from the fact that we have to lift things in awkward positions, but you know, it could also lead to you know, somebody falling, right? If I need to kind of you know, grip onto the ladder to stabilize myself, you know, again, I might fatigue and let go, or I need to lift a heavy box that I can't control because I'm in a vulnerable position, and now I'm, you know, now I'm on 2 feet instead of have that 3 point of control or contact, and that pushes me backwards and I can fall. So, um, so really, when you're looking at main and materials handling on ladders, obviously designing your storage space in your workspace to mitigate the likelihood that people need to travel up ladders. And I get that that's not always the case, but how can we kind of reduce some of that, some of the instances where people have to do that, right? And that could be where the boxes are stored, putting heavier things on the bottom or things that are accessed most frequently at a reachable level, things that aren't, accessed that frequently up at the top, but using the right type of ladder to access those things. I've heard of some companies throwing their Christmas tree at the very top and just putting it at the back and only getting it once a year, right? But that's putting people at risk for climbing up a ladder. So just having those considerations when it comes to material handling on ladders. And if you check the ministry website, again, we'll include it in the resources at the end. Talk about ascending and descending a ladder and how much there's different suggestions on how much you should be lifting as you're doing that. And I like that example, Tim, about ladders that are designed to be walked down normally, because that's a big thing too. As you're descending a ladder, can you see where you're going? If you have a big enough box, you might not see where the treads are going, and you might fall that way. So so looking for those types of things is great. I appreciate that suggestion. So like I said earlier about safe lifting and materials handling techniques specific to the type of work, consider using supervisors as lifting coaches. We're really trying to push this. Having safe lifting training is great. Obviously, providing the technique and the different things to consider about balance and about control and about matching those techniques to how you're lifting and those types of things is very important. But after that training, what types of program do you have in place to ensure that that training is ongoing, right? Like lifting properly is a learned behavior, right? It's motor learning that takes time to ensure that you kind of do it automatically for the most part, right? And using supervisors as lifting coaches to ensure that people have those techniques ongoing, ensure that type of stuff is ongoing, because you need to practice, right? You need to practice properly, and you need to practice those techniques on an ongoing basis. And of course, like anything, consider simple risk assessments for MSD hazards. We are in the process of trying to create tools to help companies do that a little bit easier, to create those simple risk assessments. There's a lot of things that go into to ergonomics, energy expenditure, and those types of things that we don't expect companies to consider sometimes, or fatigue or whatever. But there are some things that simple risk assessments can certainly solve. So we're certainly working on some information for that for you as well. And of course, any in-depth assessments for any high-risk jobs based on the results of those simple risk assessments. Storage system. So racking systems should be inspected monthly as well as annually. Of course, any damage to racking, maybe an indicator of other things, right? Cutting corners or we just created some documents on lighting in industrial workplaces, the importance of adequate lighting in industrial workplaces, checklist as well. Could be that backed into different racking based on the fact that you couldn't see, or there were shadows or whatever. So certainly make sure things are inspected monthly as well as annually. Labeling racking with maximum capacities is important as well. Ensure racking is installed as per manufacturer's instructions. Ensure the racking is appropriate for the items stored. Again, we see that a lot. I know a couple of years ago, the focus of the ministry had to do with kind of unique loads on a pallet. So maybe you had a pallet, the item didn't really fit a standardized pallet, or the weight of the object was kind of off to the side based on how it was designed. So it's more likely to kind of flip as opposed to kind of being pulled off, as kind of a normal pallet would. So so just making sure that the space and the pallet and the procedures and all those types of things are designed for those items that are stored. And that kind of goes along with those safe storage procedures, right, are beneficial to ensure that as you're moving loads on and off storage systems, that they're done in a way that you make sure that those types of things are accounted for. Again, as for automation, again, ensure lockout tagout procedures are up to date and include proper lockout instructions for entering machinery or safeguard spaces, kind of like robot or automated equipment cells. As far as I've mentioned this before, but if you have lockout tagout placards, ensuring that they're designed so that you know it's done in the order in which the types of hazardous energy are locked out in the order in which it's supposed to be done, right? So if you have kind of a placard with information all over the place, or it's not clear the order that needs to be done, then it just opens it up for misinterpretation. So just making sure the instructions are clear, right? Like step one, do step two. It's kind of written as a list as opposed to maybe across. So they're just trying to figure out ways of trying to make it so that it's not open to interpretation or being misread just based on how that placard is designed. So it's important to ensure that those instructions are written so that individuals can follow them as they go and they're trained to those things. And of course, if there's ways of producing some of that information in different languages, we've had QR codes on here, throwing QR codes where some of that stuff is in different languages. That would be amazing as well. Certainly, any machine-specific lockout tagout procedures are posted on those machines. The program should include consideration for abandoned lock removal in coordination with outside contractors, and ensure that the training is completed that includes both theory and practical application. Okay. As far as machine guarding, blocking, and lockout goes, workplace inspection should ensure that they are looking at machine guarding, so ensure that it is adequate, right? It's obviously blocking the hazard that's been identified. It's affixed properly, ensure that there isn't any damage to that guarding as well. Consider doing a machine guarding assessment. Would be beneficial to ensure that all lockout, tagout, and guarding requirements have been met. So again, you're identifying all your hazards. You want to make sure you do that assessment to ensure that any of the procedures that you have, any of the guarding requirements that you've had have been met to what has been said on the assessment. So that's critical as well. And ensure that any safeguard does not interfere with machine operation as it might be overridden. So we've seen that a bunch of times that, the guarding itself is there to protect the hazard, but the worker is unable to perform the duties of the work. So, sometimes that safeguard is tampered with or removed and opening that worker up to the hazard. So ensuring that there's the appropriate type of safeguard in place that's best for proper operation, but as well ensures the safety of the operator as well. As far as the administrative review and internal responsibility system, obviously everybody must have a sincere wish to prevent accidents and illnesses, accept that accidents and illnesses have causes that can be eliminated or at least greatly reduced. And like I said, some of the challenges that we've seen with material handling is it's how all of these types of things interact with each other, right? And making sure that we are identifying all of those variables and understanding that those variables can result in accidents, right? So I've heard of one where a forklift goes in to the trailer and the trailer's doesn't have a dock lock, so it's moving away from the dock lock for a space, right? And then as the workers driving into the warehouse, that they were looking down to make sure that there wasn't a big gap that the forklift would fall through, and they struck somebody, right? So So just the fact that those types of things exist can lead to something that maybe you didn't think would happen. So just making sure that you're looking at all of those factors as we talked about, right? Ensuring that we have a clear, like everybody has a clear understanding of their own skill, abilities, and limitations, and should have the capacity to carry out their responsibilities. We always encourage, completing a hazard identification and risk assessment to help you prioritize find and help you prioritize where those hazards are. Ensure that procedures are available, individuals are trained, and that information is communicated. And of course, the GHSC should have regular meetings as well. As far as OHS awareness training, certification part 1 and part 2, consider training on known hazards in your workplace. So, identifying what those hazards are and consider that training on those known hazards. As Julia mentioned before, workers must complete health and safety awareness training in 4 steps as soon as practicable, or at least provide that proof of completion. Newly hired or promoted supervisors should complete awareness training in 5 steps within 1 week of starting their work as a supervisor, and ensure all contractors completing work on site have completed their awareness training. So a quick rundown of the key focus areas. Like I said, we have created some resources and information based on this information from the previous couple years. And like I said, there's been some new stuff that we have coming either it's just done or has come out that we'll make sure we keep them. We'll put that in the follow-up email. And of course, stay tuned to our website. We'll have all that information ongoing throughout the whole year. And of course, if there's anything that's missing or anything that you need, feel free to reach out. I'll put my contact information in the chat, and we can certainly look at creating something that will benefit your business. Okay, back to Julie for a couple of slides before we get into some questions.
So when we look at the top 10 contraventions in the industrial, under the industrial regulations for last year's campaign, so which ended on March 31st, the top 10 orders that were issued, the first one, the most issued one, was under section 51(1)B, so lifting devices inspections, and the number in brackets was how many times it was issued. Then we go to 11A, so again, floors being kept free of hazards. Section 46, ensuring that materials, articles, or things are secured against tipping or falling. Section 45B, making sure that materials, articles, or things are safely transported, placed, or stored. Couple of guarding orders are up next, section 25, so ensuring that there's a guard on an in-running nip hazard. And then section 24, a guard on an exposed moving part. Section 49B, securing of a compressed gas cylinder. Coming in at number 8 is under section 124, which is to provide an eye wash facility. Section 13(1)B, installation of a guardrail at the open side of a mezzanine or a hole in the floor or something. And then lastly, coming in at number 10 under section 123, so those are fire code requirements regarding fire extinguishers. Next, we have the top 10 contraventions that were issued under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So the number 1 order was, and almost written twice as much as the next one, under section 25(1)B, so maintaining equipment in good condition. Very important. Next is 25(2)H, taking every precaution reasonable. Then 25(2)I, posting a copy of the act. 25(2)J, prepare and review a health and safety policy. Then 25(2)A, provide information, instruction, and supervision to a worker to ensure their health and safety. Section 8(1), ensure that you have a health and safety representative selected. So for those employers that have less than 20 workers. Then 54.1c, so the production of a document. So that's a document that already exists. So an inspector is asking for a to view or a copy of a document that you have at the workplace. Then 57.6b, which is a stop work order. 32.0.11c, review the violence and harassment policy or harassment policy. And then 32.1.011 to review either the harassment or violence in the workplace policy and to make sure that it's posted, make sure that policy is posted in the workplace. So those contraventions are from April 1st, 2024 to March 31st, 2025.
Yeah,
Sorry, I
perfect.
just saw
Thanks.
that question pop up.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Yeah, and what we tried to do, and it should be out soon as well, is Julie's nice enough to share some of these stats with us, kind of throughout the campaign, and we try to use that to help inform some of the suggestions or documents or information that we produce, or other safety connections or materials. Sometimes we take this information just as to try to emphasize this information when we're doing things like our certification training. So a lot of our instructors will, as they kind of go through their regular training and certification, they'll say, "Hey, this is what's happening. Let's talk about these things that are happening, or that inspectors are finding, at least as it pertains to material handling." So there is some information about kind of how to comply with some of these things, to try to get those numbers down this year. There's a couple things I want to chat about first, just for a few minutes, and then we'll get to some of your questions. I know Julie and others have been answering some of the questions in here, so that is perfect. Again, you can click on these links as well. Just some information about material handling, struck by, caught between, those types of things. Information about transportation equipment and vehicle traffic, and just some guidelines around pre-start health and safety reviews. And then as far as our resources go, here's a couple things as well. But like I said, we have like a big giant list that would take up a bunch of slides here for resources, but we have put our manual mechanical material handling landing page that you can go to for a bunch of resources. If you are a small business, we have a small business page that kind of breaks down your responsibilities based on the size of your business, and then helps you, build that program. Landing page, that third bullet there, just about all the initiatives that are currently going on that involve WSPS. And you'll find a list of all the resources there as well. And as I mentioned, we'll send out a post safety connection email with a bunch of resources. And then the one thing I've highlighted at the bottom is that Ergo Insights document around safe man and tools handling work design. So you can take a look at that. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out or chat with your local ergonomist about that. Just a couple of campaigns that we have coming up. If you are or know somebody, you have a local small business that you frequent, we do have another safety connection coming up on Thursday around MST prevention in the retail sector. This campaign is the focus of specialized services, the ergonomists in specialized services. So like I said, if you yourself or somebody who is a retail business, then feel free to send this information out to them, and we'll chat with them again on Thursday. There is another safety connection coming up in a few weeks on April 24th. It has to do with the exposure to chemical agents and women's training. Again, the link is there as well. They've done a great job of developing a bunch of resources last year. They did create a toolkit that has a bunch of information about the exposure, with more plans to develop more resources this year. So please join Tony and others on April 24th for that one as well. And then just a local campaign, just Southern Ontario is looking at tender fruit growers. So if you are an agriculture business and tender fruit, we do have that initiative on April 16th, and feel free to click that link. Or if you know anybody who grows tender fruit, like peaches and those types of things, then please forward that on as well. Okay, so let's get to some questions. I'm going to put up the post-webinar survey. So again, same as before. It's just another set of questions to understand what you've learned today. Again, as I mentioned, we just use this information to help improve our webinars and future awareness campaigns. And I do have to state that, again, no identifying information will be collected or asked for. It's completely anonymous. Again, it is an MLITSD survey. Again, responses will be shared with WSPS as questions are relevant to our organization. And again, your responses are confidential, and results will be analyzed in aggregate form. So we appreciate that. Totally voluntary, but certainly helps us to do that. Again, once I ask Julie some of these questions, I'll throw that link in the chat so that you have it. So just going through some of these questions here. Just the first one, it says, Julie, are there any regulations or standards that apply to forklift dash pedestrian safety in a plant, such as clearances or sector, or is it just common sense? What are your thoughts around kind of pedestrian safely, forklift, and that type of stuff?
So there is a CSA standard, B335-15, called Safety Standards for Lift Trucks, which does mention or include pedestrian safety in there. So that would probably be like the first, go-to. But of course, like WSPS has a lot of great information as well. So yeah, that would be the resource there.
Yep. No, that's good. And I mean, yeah, if you don't have access to the CSA standard, I mean, if you want to talk to one of our consultants, we can certainly help you kind of go through that if you need some more information for sure. Okay, so just triggered. What are the due diligence activities that inspectors will look for when doing inspections, specifically to material handling? Don't know if you answered that one. I'm just checking.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, yeah.
So there's a lot of due diligence, and I think somebody mentioned, like, you kind of went through all of the elements there that we're looking at. So if you're looking at your ladders, you're looking at your mobile equipment, you're covering pretty much all the bases there. We're looking for the equipment to be maintained in good condition. Inspectors will look at wear and tear on equipment. They'll look at the inspection sticker on that equipment, or the inspection records of the equipment to see if it's being inspected or maintained regularly. In the case of a lift truck or lifting devices, it has to be inspected at least annually. So that's why that order is number one under industrial regulations, because often they haven't been inspected in the last year. If an inspector suspects that equipment is not properly maintained, they can issue orders accordingly. Inspectors may also ask about training records for workers. If they notice damage to equipment or racking, and I think Don mentioned this already, they might question workers if they've been properly trained or if the equipment is being used safely. So, just some little tidbits there.
Yeah, perfect. And just going back to the comment about the NIOSH lifting equation. So if you're not familiar with that, it's just an equation that was developed in a lab way back. I think the first time was 1981 and then updated in 1991. I believe, don't hold me to those dates, but it's important just with those types of equations, like the NIOSH equation, for example, is that it can only be used in certain situations. So you can't use it for, lifting something with one hand, right? So there's only so many applicable scenarios in which some of these tools can be applied, because the research was based on, lifting a box and moving it to here, and they came up with some of these correction factors for some of that lifting. So you just have to make sure you're cognizant of the fact that, the application of some of these tools, it may just consider certain things and not other things, but it may give you a decent idea of where some of the hazards are. So like with NIOSH, for example, like you can play around with the numbers, and if you do a lot of twisting, the correction factor there, if there's no twisting, that the factor is 1. So if you lift 23 kilograms and there's no twisting, which is a risk for lifting, that correction factor is 1. So it says, well, you can lift 23 kilograms, right? But again, if they say, well, there's some twisting, it's 0.5, then you're at half that amount, right? Is kind of the recommended uh, 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 weight limit, right? So the fact that you are twisting, you could say, well, that changed how much I can lift. So maybe I need to figure out how to reduce the lift. So some of these tools, will give you some insight as some of the factors that might be reducing the capability of the individual to lift. So, but just make sure that you kind of you're applying it correctly. If you want to use it, there's some spreadsheets online that we found that some of the calculations are off in the spreadsheet, which may give you incorrect answers. So that's why we try to use like the original research-based tools that are out there, like Liberty Mutual manual tools handling tools. There's some tools on WorkSafe BC as well, that we use just to ensure that we're not doing our assessments using data that maybe is not completely accurate. Okay, so what is the criteria the MLITSD will be using to select workplaces for inspection under the current material handling campaign? So I think you answered that at the beginning, but do you just want to give a quick overview, Julie, on that one?
Yeah, so we've selected sectors for inspectors to go to, related to where fatalities and critical injuries are occurring. They are not limited to those sectors. So if you don't fall into one of those sectors, you know, you might say, oh, well, great, I'm not going to get a visit as part of this campaign. That's not necessarily so. They are not limited to those sectors. Inspectors can choose to go to any workplace that they think, might fit the bill for this campaign. So the criteria, each inspector has an inspection area that they that they look after, let's say, and they'll try and, for these proactive visits, typically inspectors will try to go to workplaces maybe where they haven't been before or haven't been in a long time, and because they may have workplaces where they go reactively, and so they're already into those workplaces, so they're going to try and choose workplaces maybe where they don't normally attend and would be a good fit for this campaign, but they're not limited to where they can go.
Perfect. Okay, I'm just looking for this resource for this next question. So I'm going to put this, it's just about any tools for supervisors to use for safe lifting coaching. So I'm going to put that in our resources, actually. There are a couple of documents on our website about safe lifting for supervisors. So, ensuring that safe lifting practices are used in the workplace, with that free material handling resource. So yeah, it's part of our kind of lifting training is we kind of take the supervisors aside and we want them to understand, how to teach the lifting properly. There are some kind of nuances with lifting, to help coach individuals through that proper lifting. So, I'll make sure I include those in the post Safety Connection email. So you have those to ensure you continue to kind of do that coaching over and over again, even if it's like a, safety talk or, similar to, supervisor that notices somebody who's not lifting properly and trying to figure out what, why they are. Maybe it's not the person, didn't decide to, lift properly. Maybe it's just based on how the place is laid out or where items are located that may be resulting in some of those poor lifts. So I'll make sure I include that. And the thing with lifting too is that I often ask companies, do you consider, poor lifting a near miss, right? Like if you see somebody bending down at the waist and, using their back and lifting something heavy and they do that and they don't get injured, are you like, well, it must be safe, right? But, do you count that the same as somebody almost getting hit by a forklift, right? They didn't get hurt, but it was close, right? Is that, the same thing where maybe their tissues in their back just didn't let go for whatever reason, right? Or didn't tear for whatever reason. So I would consider looking at how to incorporate that into your program if you're looking for ways of supporting either training or redesign of looking at or counting some of your poor lifts as near miss. Question from, we got that. Okay, question from Caleb. You mentioned you're working on something for simple risk assessments. Any details you can share? Yeah, like we're just trying to do a simple, one-page risk assessment that applies certain criteria. For example, we know that the shoulder, if we work overhead, we do, more than 2.5 motions per minute with the shoulder, for example, overhead, that we start to see injuries of the shoulder from repetition increase. So we're trying to incorporate some of that research into these types of tools to give you an idea where the risk is, provide you with red, yellow, green. And to be honest with you, you're either above 2.5 or below 2.5 motions per minute, for example. So there's really no yellow there. Like if you're just below or just above, with some ergonomic stuff, it either is a risk or it's either high risk or more likely to create injury, I should say, and less likely. But we do that. We've applied a scoring system to ensure that it helps you to prioritize those jobs in red, yellow, green. So you get an idea of where your risk is as well. So yeah, we're working on that. I mean, we're reviewing it. We're testing it. We have tested it. We want to make sure that we are validating it as well. So just like I just mentioned before about different tools that that may have some calculations that are off, that we want to make sure that we're validating it so that it's you're getting the answers that you need. So that stuff is certainly coming soon. As far as sharing it goes, we don't have plans to share it at this point. We certainly want to teach professionals or ergo teams about using it. There are some things in there that we want to make sure that we're picking up on to do those types of simple risk assessments, but certainly stay tuned to our website or reach out to any of your ergonomists for any more information on that. But stay tuned for that as well. Okay, we have another question here. I don't know if we can answer this one. I'm going to ask you, Julie, but if you can't answer it, that's fine. Maybe we can get the answer. But it says, for food safety reasons, it is acceptable to have the machine-specific lockout tagout procedure available in a binder within the department instead of having it posted on the machine. Is this okay, or have you come across this before?
Yeah, I mean, there's no requirement to have it posted on the machine. It's ideal, but in the case of food safety, yes, absolutely. If it's not, if you're not able to do it, or it's not convenient, then if it's located in the department, then that's fine. I've seen them, laminated pictograms, that kind of thing, which are great. But in I'm not sure about your specific setup or your specific circumstances, but if that's not available to be done where it can be washed daily or whatever the case might be, then just having them available for everybody, I think is probably acceptable. Yeah.
Perfect. If a step stool weighs 300 pounds and has a Type 1A extra heavy industrial rating, will it meet the legislative requirements as per the Health and Safety Act? Any comments on that?
I'm guessing they mean it has a capacity of 300 pounds, not that the
Probably,
step
yeah.
stool itself weighs 300
Yeah, I was
pounds.
going to say, from an ergonomics perspective, that might not be great. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to be moving that around too much.
No.
So that depends. Like you have to look at your circumstances. So you have to look at, who's using that step stool. Are they carrying large items? Like, do they have to lift large items? Are they wearing a heavy tool belt when they're on that step stool? So you have to look at your specific circumstances to make sure that you're using the right piece of equipment there.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm muting on and off because my dog is barking for some reason. This is a great question by Rebecca because I've heard about this before. So when an inspector, can you just let everybody know like how an inspector should identify themselves? Mentioned that we had an inspector who said they were, or so they had somebody who said they were inspector walk in the back of the shop, asked an employee for a supervisor, but then left without inspecting or speaking with anybody. So kind of what is typically the
So
process
I
of an
think I went,
inspector? Yeah.
yeah, I think I went through a little bit before. So typically
Okay.
they would come in the front door and ask to speak to a supervisor. They would introduce themselves. They'd let you know why they're there. They would typically provide a business card. If folks want to see additional identification, you can ask for that. They will show their badge and their warrant card. But if they walked in the back, maybe that's unless they were familiar with that workplace. Some inspectors are quite familiar with the workplaces that they go to, so they maybe would walk into a side door or back door because they are familiar with that workplace. But if it was the first time you were getting an inspection, I would be surprised that an inspector would arrive at the back door and then would leave without speaking to anybody. Very unusual, and maybe chalk it up to being your lucky day. You didn't get an inspection that day. They walked out without
Well, there you go.
talking to anybody.
Nice.
That one's hard to explain.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a tough one, but great question. Yeah. Another one about the hospital sector. So in that one, the only advice I'd give you is that just because the presentation, at least this portion of the campaign, is not specifically, or at least we're not partnering on the hospital sector, but you can certainly go to these additional resources here. The safe man materials handling work design doesn't necessarily cover the specifics about patient handling and those types of things, but does have some information about cart design. So if you're looking at medicine carts, food carts, any housekeeping carts, those types of things, this information could apply. But if you had any questions about that, you can certainly reach out to myself on that, or certainly connect with some consultants at PSHSA that deals with healthcare. Okay, so a couple more here. Okay, so will the simple risk assessment include psychophysical hazards or guidance on how to complete this type of assessment? We recently received an ML order for this. Yeah, so those, it definitely will not. So, when you look at like a biomechanical or psychophysical hazard, typically the ministry ergonomist, those are the two types of assessments that they're looking for to help quantify some of that risk, right? So, so again, in that case, the simple assessment will provide some information based on some research on certain conditions that have been known to create, injury. But, when you look at what the ministry ergonomists are looking for, it's more of those biomechanical analyses using all of the different hazards, to ensure we accurately quantify the risk. So if you're having an order for that, if you want to reach out, we're more than happy to help you kind of navigate that. So like I said, I'll put my email address in the chat, and if you want to connect with me on that, I can certainly help navigate the requirements of that for you if you need some help. Okay, so I'm just looking here. Another question, how often are the pre-start reviews required to be updated?
So there's no requirement to update. So pre-start reviews are done before a piece of equipment is installed or put into operation. So once that piece of equipment is in operation, then the pre-start review doesn't need to be updated in any way unless you're making major changes to that piece of equipment, unless you're making changes based on that one of the items in the table in section 7. So if you're adding, light curtains, let's say, to a piece of equipment, then you would have to do a pre-start review on that item. But there's no requirement for the pre-start itself to be updated. It's recommended that you keep a copy of your pre-start. That way, if an inspector asks about, oh, you've got a new piece of equipment here, have you done if the one of the items in the table applies, that they may ask, have you done a pre-start? And you might want to keep, a copy of your pre-start review to show the inspector that, yes, you did do a pre-start review on that piece of equipment. And, here's the results. But there's no requirement for that pre-start once that piece of equipment is in operation to update it or keep it updated, unless you make, like I said, changes to that would affect the equipment. But again, it has to be based on one of the items in the table.
Yeah, and that's always the challenge with safety, right? Is work changes, it's fluid, processes change, materials change, equipment is purchased, and making sure that we're part of that discussion, that process, so that we can ensure that those types of things are accounted for when those items, like Julie said, if a new piece of machinery is brought in, that that these types of things need to be done. I've been to places where, people come to work and they're like, oh, when did we get that new machine, right? And then there's, in that instance, you may be not in compliance because of you didn't do your pre-start health and safety review, or it's adding to the noise, and then that's going to change. Maybe before you were below 85 and now you're above because that machine is creating so much noise, and now you have to deal with hearing protection and those types of things. So, I think being part of those conversations ahead of time is kind of the dream. I don't know if we dream about this kind of thing, but is the dream, right? Of saying, hey, we're thinking about purchasing this. What types of things do you need to put in place to ensure everybody's operating it safely, and that is part of that kind of workplace layout and design and those types of things of how, as you introduce things or take things away, that's either increasing or decreasing hazards, right? So things are fluid and changing all the time, and just making sure that as a company, we're kind of on top of those things, so that we're not letting those hazards exist for a significant period of time before we get to them to do these types of things, right? So should be part of your installation process is doing what you need to do to ensure the safe operation of that machinery, and all of the relevant kind of upstream and downstream processes that may be affected based on the inclusion of that new machine.
And I think one of the links from us is on the guideline for pre-start health and safety review. So it does that's a great guideline. So if you have any questions about section 7, then that's a great resource to go to.
Perfect. We have a few minutes left. If there's any other last minute questions, you have an expert, I think it's this way on my screen on the line here, that says offering any answers to any questions. Just looking to see, I know I have some pre-developed questions here to see if there's any that haven't been asked. I was just thinking back to, I'll just ask one, Julie, I think, and then we'll call it a morning. But just based on some of, like you said, the common issued orders from the previous couple of years, like you said, it seems to be that most of those are, like you said, are double, are the items in good repair, right? Making sure things are in good repair. Like, is there any advice that you could give companies to try to stay on top of those things? Like, is there like strengthening supervision or worker education or those types of anything that you advice you can give to try to keep people on top of that stuff to make sure that we don't get that many orders?
Yeah, I think maybe ensuring that you have a robust reporting system so that if workers do identify issues with the equipment that they're using on a daily basis, they know where to go and they feel comfortable going to either the supervisor or the employer with their concern. Or like how are they reporting that? And then where is that report going? Who's addressing that report? So whether it's, equipment or the tools that they're using, or the setup of their, workstation or things like that. If they have any concerns, what do they do with that and where do they go? It's great if you're doing your monthly workplace inspections and the workers going around and they should be engaging with their coworkers to say, do you have any health and safety concerns? But a worker shouldn't have to wait till the end of the month for that workplace inspection either. So if something does come up in the interim, that they know where to go with their concern.
Yeah, and things are going to happen, right? Things are going to break.
Mhm.
Things are going to, mistakes are going to be made. I mean, we want to make sure, failure happens. We just want to make sure failure happens safely, right? And I think workers being comfortable to do just that, to report when things have been damaged. Hey, you know what? I hit the racking, it was a total accident. I was doing this without fear of, you know, um, whatever. Just making sure that you have that culture of reporting, right? That people feel comfortable to say, hey, look, doesn't look right, or this doesn't look right, or whatever it is important to make sure that those things are captured right away so they can be fixed. So that's not that lingering hazard. Um, that goes on, like you said, Julie, to the end of the month when somebody notices, right? Um, I think fear of getting in trouble sometimes may,
Mhm.
prevent people from saying stuff. But if you kind of have that culture of openness and whatever, we know stuff happens, and um, just make sure people are comfortable speaking up and speaking out to make sure that it's safe for everybody. So, no, that was a great answer. Um, yeah, appreciate everybody joining today. Like I said, we have a number of different safety connections coming up over the next couple of weeks. Um, specific to, like I said, with chemicals and retail and tender fruit and all those types of things. So again, if that's not you, that's totally fine. But please spread the word so we can get that information out to all levels of business, small, medium size, for sure. And again, check our website for more information. And again, any questions, health and safety contact centers there. If you have any questions about any information, you can contact myself. If you have any ergo questions, for sure. But I can certainly get you in touch with anybody here at WSPS, um, or our contact or our customer care as well will certainly put you in contact with the right individuals. So appreciate it. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great week, and let's hope for warmer weather. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Julie.